Mom, Dad, there's no way that I can express to you what I'm feeling right now. My heart is full to bursting, except to say, I'm the king of the world!
Hello and welcome back to Cameron, King of the World. And yes, we're still not done with Titanic. Can you believe it? And as a matter of fact, this documentary that we're about to talk about, which is Titanic, The Final Word with James Cameron, I almost considered not using in the overall series, but I'm really glad that I did, and that'll probably become clear as I get through the video and talking about this documentary. But, just to go back to the beginning a little bit, when I was planning this series, I thought, ooh, I could do more than just his, 7 feature films. I could do this, and there's this documentary, and I could talk about that. And then I thought, well, it could be 31 videos, and it could be like a month-long series. I don't know why the number 31 appeals to me so much. It's not a round number, but it's the most number of days in a month, and there's just something special about the number 31. I don't know what it is. So I thought, oh, I could do 31. And then I realized I was kind of padding things out. And I was like trying to find things to make separate videos about. And then as I got into it and really started filming the videos months and months ago, I then started realizing there was so much I wanted to talk about, so much I wanted to cover, and I'm glad that this one stayed in the 31 cut, because there are a few videos that I'm not going to make because I just don't have the time, and it doesn't fit that neat 31 number of videos, which is completely arbitrary. I could just do 34 videos if I wanted to, but I'm trying to stick to the 31 for now, and that's really the only time I have is to do the 31 videos. But I'm really glad that this one stayed in the project. So this is a 2012 documentary which was written and produced and directed by Tony Gerber, and is featuring James Cameron very heavily, which is why I decided to include it. And it was made to commemorate and also to kind of tie in with the 100th anniversary of the Titanic sinking in 2012, which was a big year for Titanic, the movie as well. They had a big re-release in 3D in the cinema, big premiere at the Royal Albert Hall, which is a really special moment for a lot of people involved in the making of the film, having the live orchestra there and stuff. I think that was actually the first time that James Horner, the composer of the score, had met the actual orchestra. So it was like a very cool kind of celebratory, year for the film in 2012. And that's something I'm going to touch on throughout this video too, is the idea of celebrating the Titanic, but also, becoming excited about the wreck of Titanic and kind of the moral implications of that. And again, we'll get into that a little bit later on in the video. But this is a documentary focusing on James Cameron amassing a whole group of panelists of sorts, though it doesn't really play out in a kind of what's the term? There's not really like a panel discussion. It's not like a round table. It's not like a round table kind of thing where everyone's sitting around and talking about this. People are getting up and kind of looking through schematics and showing things on the screen, and there's a lot of conversation back and forth, and it's a very well edited and paced documentary. It's an hour and 36 minutes, so it's a real lengthy, chunky exploration of the wreck of the Titanic. And this is really the main focus of the film, is the mystery around the way that the Titanic has been left at the bottom of the ocean, in the Atlantic. How did it end up in the two pieces, and how did it break? When did it break? Did we portray the break of the film snapping in half in the movie correctly? Why is the boilers in this place on the bottom of the seabed? Why is this place there? Why is that part of the bottom of the ship away from everything else? It doesn't make sense, and there are these mysteries, and they're kind of trying to forensically analyze all of these bits and pieces. And Cameron has brought together an incredible group of people who are like historians, experts on the Titanic, and lots of different people who have a lot of expertise in very specific points of work that relate to shipwrecks and the Titanic more specifically. There's one man who he knows everything about the Titanic, and that goes to Cameron as well. I mean, Cameron, I've seen a few people talk about the kind of documentaries that Cameron does, diving the Titanic and doing these deep sea dives and all that kind of stuff, and they view it as vanity projects for Cameron. He's just doing this to kind of placate his own ego. And I do think he has an ego, and I think we all have an ego to some extent. I think Cameron has an especially large ego, but I think that it's a healthy ego, and I think that he backs it up with a shit ton of hard work. And he talks in this documentary about how he has spent 15 years of his life at that point obsessed with Titanic, diving to Titanic. He actually went down to Titanic 33 times. This isn't a guy who went down there once to film some footage for the movie and then, like, you know, win all the awards and be like, yeah, I'm an expert on the Titanic. He has been down there 33 times. And that's studying the ship. That's like, you know, for scientific research. It's not just to make a cool documentary or get some nice 3D footage like he did with Ghost of the Abyss. It's like he's genuinely interested, intrigued, and has a love and he's drawn to the wreck of the Titanic and the beauty of it and the tragedy of it. And he talks about how he could walk the ship in his sleep, like he knows it that well at this point. But he gathers all these people around, and you know, they use clips from the movie, and one very random aside is the clips of the movie that they use in this documentary. They look a little bit off to me. Like, some of the visual effects don't look as good. I don't know whether they've just kind of zoomed in and cropped the image a little bit, or whether they've brightened the footage, because some of the shots where they're lowering the people into the water once the Titanic is static and sinking, the backgrounds look off. That they don't look as polished as the final movie. I think they've brightened the footage or something. I don't know. There's something lost in translation now with the use of the clips, which is a completely random point that no one in the world will care about. But for some reason, I was noticing it and kind of getting a little bit bothered by it. So that's one thing. But they use clips from the movie, which is like a great tool to kind of visualize, even if it's not completely historically accurate. And they talk about whether the movie was accurate or not, and how much Cameron wanted it to be accurate. Again, we'll get to that in just a little bit as well. And then they also use these, the CGI animation. And one of the big kind of goals of this documentary and project for Cameron is to redo the digital animation of the ship sinking. Now, they did one in 1995 for the movie, which you see at the beginning when they show old Rose how the ship sank, and they use that in the movie. Obviously, that's a scene in the movie. But they made that animation in 1995, and they got a few things wrong, and Cameron wanted to make the definitive digital reconstruction of exactly how the ship sank. Now, one documentary I had slated for this series, but I ultimately removed, was a 2017 documentary from National Geographic called Titanic 20 Years Later with James Cameron, something to that effect it was called. It's on Disney Plus, you can see it very easily. And it's like, I think, like a 20-30 minute documentary, and it's Cameron reflecting on the movie after 20 years, but also speaking to survivors of the Titanic. I may have mentioned this before. And in that documentary, he's again like looking for a way to represent the way the Titanic sank, but using a model. And in that documentary, he's getting really excited about the model breaking and stuff and getting it to look exactly like it did. And he's getting frustrated that they're not getting it right and stuff. And then at one point he's saying, like, I need to remember that this was something where a lot of people died, and I'm getting frustrated and or excited about this, and it's a little bit in poor taste. But he really is just excited about the prospect of, historically providing something that will give people the best possible context for what happened with the Titanic, because the movie is the movie, and that's kind of one thing. But he can do so much better with a scientific portrayal. So, and he talks about, and we'll just get to that now, I guess, while I'm talking about it. He talks about the things that he didn't get right with the movie in terms of, one of the big things is the way that the ship sank. So when it tilts up out of the water and then it goes vertical, that didn't happen. There's artistic license with that, but it's also based on, eyewitness accounts. And they talk about the kind of shifting accounts from survivors as well, and how that plays into the overall remembrance of Titanic and how people thought that it had sank and whether it, split into two pieces or not. But Cameron, he talks about how, with the movie there's artistic license, but also they didn't know as much as they do at that point in time in 2012. They'd learned more, and more science had gone into it, more study had gone into it, and things like that. And so actually the ship didn't really tilt that much more than, I think they agreed on, like 23 degrees out of the water, and it certainly didn't go vertical before it sank. But it kind of did just towards the end. So they kind of got the basic, broad strokes, which is something Cameron says a lot. The broad strokes are there in the movie. But, he doesn't feel like he's going to go back and change a lot of these things with the film, because he says, once you change one thing, where does that stop? Where does that end? You just keep changing things and changing things and changing things. And he also said that, the people who are going to be bothered by these kind of differences and changes is like 8 people in the world, and he counts himself as one of those people. And he says, but, I can live with it. It's going to bother me, but I can live with that. It's these things that in the movie could be changed, but, it is a deep and dark path sometimes when you start changing a film, especially with historical accuracy. The only thing that he had changed was the way the sky looked at the night of the sinking, where the kind of the constellation, I don't know, there's like a certain view of what you would see from the Atlantic Ocean at that point on that specific night in terms of the star field, and it was wrong in the movie, and so Cameron corrected that for the 3D release and then subsequently the Blu-ray release as well. So that was one thing he changed. But as far as like the way the ship's sinking, and they talk about that with the guys who are all gathered around, and they're talking about how, well, it would really go like this, and Cameron's like, yeah, well, next time I get a 1.5 million ton ship built and I place it in a tank, and it's just like, when am I going to do that again? Like, we're not going to make the whole movie again. It isn't feasible. So that's just one thing that they touch on in the film, but it's not, I like that it's not the main focus. It's not like how, where did we go wrong, and how could the movie have done it better? It's really more focused on, like, let's figure out exactly how this thing sank and all that. Well, not how it sank, how it sank, but not, I know, because that's a tricky thing. It's not, they know that it hit the iceberg, they know that much. And they talk a little bit about how much the water fills the actual boat, like the certain sections of the ship that get filled up, and how that kind of, how the tipping point and kind of the stress point on the bottom of the ship. And this one guy had worked out these ridiculously like detailed kind of schematics, and kind of working it through like through a computer of just a lot of detail that I think it was impossible to do inside your head. But they have all these different models and different cross sections of the ship and stuff, computer models inside a computer. And so they learn all these things, but then there's also kind of anomalies and outliers about how did this part of the ship end up there on the seabed when there's nothing to explain why it was there. And it's really interesting, actually. And I thought that it would be a little bit dry. I remember when I first got the Blu-ray, I was like, oh, the documentary called The Final Word with James Cameron. I thought it'd be like a 10-minute interview with Cameron reflecting on the movie, but it's like this whole fully fledged feature-length documentary and exploration of the shipwreck. And there's a lot of really good like perspectives, like using the visual computer animation, particularly just seeing like a bird's eye view of the seabed and where all the various pieces kind of are and where they landed and stuff. And there's all these schematics on the table when they've got, I love the set that they built. Well, it's not a set, but it looks like it's in a warehouse, and they've got a huge model of the shipwreck. They've got like screens around them and everything. It's a big table, lots of like references around them, and it's like, it feels like they're hashing stuff out. But Cameron definitely is like asserting himself. Cameron is holding court in this situation, which makes sense. I mean, he's the guy who's bringing in the attention. If they were to make a documentary saying like exploring the shipwreck of Titanic 100 years later, would people watch it? Yes. But would more people watch James Cameron's final word on Titanic? Yeah, I think so, because he has a name value. And that name value is also attached and forever linked to Titanic through the movie and the dives that he's done and so on. So, it feels right that he's kind of holding things together, and he's like, he's driving the conversations. But I also think that he has a valid spot on that group. He has really studied it. It's not like he made the movie and kind of, learned some trivia briefly. Like, he knows his stuff. And also when the guys start talking about lots of scientific terms and and they're talking about the way that the water column was bringing down so much force when the ship landed on the bottom of the seabed, and Cameron's given all his theories and ideas and stuff, and how there's all these technical terms that I would never have, like, if someone said that to me, I wouldn't really quite fully understand. And Cameron's reading it, and he's firing back with his own stuff. And so it feels like he belongs. It feels like he probably would have been a scientist or someone who knows a lot about this. He's a very intelligent guy, basically. So he fits well in that group. And they get into some disagreements. There's one thing where he's like, no, it would be this. And this one guy's like, I don't know. And it cuts to his interview with this guy who disagrees with him. And he just said, I just professionally disagree with this, and that's that. So you just move on, because I professionally disagree with that statement. And there's a few moments where he gets a little bit testy, and Cameron starts to kind of throw his challenge out there, and he's like, oh, really? So that's fun to me. And especially towards the last half hour of the film, the kind of most enjoyable section is when Cameron proposes to the group, okay, let's say that you're the captain of the Titanic, and you're going to go back in time onto the ship just after the iceberg hit the side. You can't do anything differently. You're hitting the iceberg, but how would you manage what happens next? Do you think you could save everybody? And one of the men is like, no, it's not possible to save everybody on that ship. More, yes, you could get that number of survivors up higher, but there's no way to save all of them. And Cameron's like, I think you could. I think you could save all of them. I can think of multiple ways. And they're like, and they're skeptical, and he's talking about all of his things, and Cameron's ideas are like, there was apparently a ship 6 or 7 miles nearby. Cameron's like, just drive the Titanic to the ship. And the guy's like, well, it would have taken about an hour to get there. And he's like, well, the ship was going to stay afloat. And they're like, well, it would have, it wouldn't have worked with the water that's in the ship. And Cameron was like, well, drive the ship backwards or put everyone on the iceberg. And they're like, how'd you climb onto the iceberg? And Cameron's like, well, you'd find a way, wouldn't you? And they're like, well, it's not that easy. So Cameron's got all these ideas. They talk about putting mattresses to kind of plug the holes of the ship, and it's really interesting how they discuss it, and the back and forths, and the kind of the tension that evolves between the group as Cameron's like throwing his things out there, and people need to challenge him, and he challenges them right back, and it makes kind of fun, kind of semi-explosive viewing. Not quite, but there's like a fun kind of promise of disagreements and kind of sparks flying, and I enjoyed the kind of the charged energy at certain points throughout the documentary. And I really enjoyed seeing the different perspectives of the ship sinking through the various CGI views of it. But just again seeing the clips from the film when the iceberg hits, and just it still is chilling to me, the whole situation. And I feel like the movie just puts you there. It really puts you there in a way that is just, it's chilling. Again, there's no other word for it. It's chilling. It's haunting. It's captivating. And one thing I wanted to mention that I don't think I really mentioned before. It's a very quick aside, because I've obviously talked about the documentary Ghosts of the Abyss and stuff, and the other deep sea documentaries that Cameron did, and the ROVs that Cameron used and his brother Mike Cameron developed and created. The two ROVs, the remotely operated vehicles, are called Jake and Elwood. I don't think I ever mentioned that. And the fact that I'm a huge fan of the Blues Brothers, I just thought that's kind of fun, and I've never mentioned it. And there's not really anything else to say about it. I just enjoy the reference to the Blues Brothers. There's a really good story in this documentary about one of the guys who's like a really big expert on the Titanic, and he's worked with a lot of the stuff that was recovered from the Titanic. And he said that the smell of the things that were brought up from the seabed that from the Titanic, they have this certain smell about them, and it's uncomfortable. Like, it just smells like death. It's not a very nice smell. But he said that they actually found some perfume that had been undisturbed. And so they opened up this leather satchel, and this like fruity fragrance came out. And he gets really choked up and starts crying in the documentary, because for him it felt like the ship had begun to live again for just a brief few minutes. And the kind of, and that is a powerful thing, a scent from the Titanic after 100 years, or however long it was at the point that he discovered that perfume. And it is it's a touching moment when he's very open and just reveals how emotional that made him. And that was a nice little mini story amidst the more technical analysis of the shipwreck. And speaking of stories, I was really intrigued. They talk about the survivors and their recollections, and that's something I've always thought is like, well, how did they not know until the 80s that the ship split in two, when there were fucking hundreds of people who survived that ship, and they would have been looking at the ship? I'm sorry, if you were getting off that ship and you saw it sinking into the fucking ocean, you wouldn't be looking the other way, you'd be looking at the ship. So how could hundreds of people not see that it split in half, if it did in fact split in half? And, and it had to have split at the surface, because it doesn't quite explain, because they're so far away from each other on the seabed, like half a mile away, I think, the two big parts of the ship. So, it stands to reason and everything. When they first found the wreck in 1985, I believe, 1986, in the mid-80s, they found the shipwreck finally and saw that it was in two halves. I mean, there's that film, Raise the Titanic, and at the end of the movie, they bring it up, and it's full and it's intact. I also like the artist who has made a career of drawing these beautiful paintings of the Titanic, and he said that when he first saw the images of the ship and realized that it was split in two, but also that, it was in such bad condition, it was almost like losing a family member, because he's been so intimately involved in painting the ship over the years that seeing it in such a horrible state was like crushing to him, like soul crushing, genuinely. And he painted like the wreck and stuff, and it was kind of difficult for him. But anyway, so the stories and recollections, I was thinking, like, why aren't people? And the truth is, no one really cared. Like, no one really, like, the wider kind of community didn't really care too much about the survivors and their stories. So it was really down to a few people who were like, well, let's go speak to them and see what they have to say. And there's this one woman who was there on the ship when she was a young girl, 11, 12 years old, and she heard an explosion, and she saw the ship split in half. And she gave a talk maybe a few decades ago at some convention about the Titanic, and she's sitting there talking about how she heard the explosion and the ship split in two. And apparently after she'd finished talking, someone came in and took the microphone and said, she's older, she's probably just, not remembering properly. It's like they're trying to cover it up, the idea that the ship would split in two, and it was kind of like a PR thing, like a public, we don't want people to think that this thing split in half, and they almost want you to think that it's kind of preserved perfectly at the bottom of the ocean as this like grand monument of this great ship, but it's a fucking wreck down there. And they didn't want people thinking that the ship had split in half. And it's this weird thing where it's kind of like it ties into the way that people manipulate things that the public sees and what they want the public to believe when you look at that stuff. I don't know, I found a really interesting analog between, kind of almost covering up the fact that the ship split in half and, fake news. It was that kind of thing where it's just like, don't believe the people who were there because they probably didn't remember it rightly, And it is true that recollections of memories become the memory, and the further you get removed from stuff like that and you tell the story more and more times, the story becomes the memory as opposed to the actual. I'm really intrigued by that, how memory works, and there are some things in my childhood where I'm not sure they're actually really memories. That's a whole other thing to talk about. But so I was fascinated by that, and they talk about the recollections and everything available basically. And another thing was how the ship sank so evenly. Like almost every ship that sinks in the sea, it capsizes, it tips over onto its side. The Titanic didn't do that. It just very evenly, I think it listed just a few degrees, but just stayed kind of perfectly still and just slowly sank downwards. So there was no capsizing effect. And Cameron said that he'd never even thought about that really, and how strange that was until they were doing this documentary. So there are all these things that people, they've been thinking about the Titanic for decades and stuff, and there are these little things that you forget or you don't think about thoroughly, and that's really what the film is exploring, is kind of diving into those things, and no pun intended, and trying to figure out exactly why everything is in its place and what really happened with the ship when it sank and the split and all that kind of stuff. And in the movie, I'm not sure if it's because in the animation in the movie, the point where the ship splits was not correct. They figured out where it split, using all of the technology and stuff. I'm not sure if it was the same when the ship splits in the actual movie section of the movie, not the animation. But either way, they did get that part incorrect. But it was, it's a negligible amount where I don't think it's wildly off base, and it's still. And again, even the ship going up at such a high angle, it's more dramatic for the movie. I don't find too much of a problem with that. I think if Cameron had access to those details when he made the movie, he might have done it just a 23-degree, lifting up from the water. He might not have. He might have still gone for the kind of more dramatic kind of, Hollywood version, which is a more dramatic and exciting and kind of puts you in that place in an even more, surreal sense, I think. And there's a fun behind it. Well, it's fun to me. There's a behind the scenes clip from the making of the movie, and one of the experts on the Titanic, who is involved in this documentary as well, he's there on the set when they're lowering down the escape boats. And he's on a megaphone or like maybe a walkie-talkie, speaking to Cameron on the other side of the set, the big Titanic ship set. And he's like, the people would actually be doing this, and you should do it a little bit differently because this is how it actually happened. And Cameron just gets back on his receiver and he's just like, what was it he said exactly? Thanks for your opinion. Now I'm going to make it exciting. And he has this kind of like impish kind of look on his face, like he's almost like, he's enjoying challenging the guy. But it's like, okay, thanks for your opinion. Now I'm going to make it exciting because it's a movie, So, I don't know. I kind of enjoy it when Cameron's a bit of a dick like that. And I just, if it was me, it would really wind me up. But for some reason, when I see, this is completely way off base, but it's like Joe Pesci, right? I love Joe Pesci. And I just hear these stories of him being such a dick to people. And I just find it funny. If I was in the situation, I'd be crushed and I'd be really annoyed and think, what a rude twat. But when I hear him, I don't know, I find it funny. It's just one of those weird things, and it's the truth. I'm just being honest, I just find it funny. But, and that's another thing, you talk about the tact of this kind of thing, and Cameron's talking about the new animation that they're putting together, and he's like, this is going to look so cool. And like the ship snaps, and he's narrating it, and all the different points where the stern of the ship is spiraling as it goes down. He's like, right, that's spiraling, this bit's coming off, and then bang, it hits the ground. He's like, bada bing, bada boom, that's it. And it just feels so tactless, And I think he does comment on that in the 20 Years Later documentary about how, for him, it's exciting because he wants to have had a part in creating something that shows people exactly how it happened, or at least the closest to how it happened, even more so than the movie. It's almost like he's trying to fix the mistakes he made in the movie, but in this CGI animation clip that for him is going to stand as this kind of definitive digital breakdown of exactly how the ship sank and where the shipwreck landed, all that kind of stuff. And for me, it was very interesting. I was really captivated by the whole thing. I thought it was a fantastic documentary. I highly enjoyed it, and I'd probably watch it again because I am so fascinated with the shipwreck. And I did think, having watched the movie, having watched all the documentaries on the making of the movie, having listened to the audio commentaries, plural, having then done the documentary on the Ghost of the Abyss, and then filming the reviews for all of these things, and I even filmed a review of Titanic twice in the past 6 months, I thought I was done and I'd be sick to death to see another thing. But with this documentary, I thought, let's just get it out of the way. And it was anything but getting it out of the way. It was a really fun experience to watch this. And again, you say fun, and you know, it is one of those things where it's a tragedy, but I think it's so well put together, and it is enjoyable. And that's the thing. It's kind of a forensic kind of analysis and exploration of the shipwreck. And sometimes you just need to remove the emotions of things like that when you're trying to discover what happened. You know, so it's kind of like that a little bit. And at the very end of the film, I found it really interesting how Cameron said, "This is my final word on Titanic," and then of course he did the 20 years later documentary about 5 years afterwards. But you know, this is my final word in the Titanic. And also he said that he thinks the reason the story of the ship is so popular is because really you can look at the Titanic as a microcosm for the world today. And I thought, okay, he's getting a bit bold with this kind of analogy, but it's actually really fitting. He talks about how the ship has all the different classes, you know, the high class, the kind of the upper class, and then the lower class at the bottom, who are just in steerage and just like, they're the people who are going to suffer the most. And, you know, Titanic is like, you know, man's hubris, like we're bigger and better than everything, and we're in this big ship and nothing can destroy us, we're unsinkable. And then nature's right there with this iceberg, and you know, man's hubris just comes right back at it and carves a fucking dent through the, you know, the side of the ship. Ship starts to sink, and they tried to turn, but it was too late, you know. And now the ship's going down, and then the people who are rich and more well off, they're going to be fine. They're going to get, you know, first dibs on the escape boats and everything. They're going to survive. But the people who are down at the bottom and the lower class, they've got really little chance of surviving. And that is kind of where the world is going. And he makes a comparison to climate change, and how, as far as the world and climate change is concerned right now, you know, we're heading for the iceberg, but there's no time to kind of, you know, completely miss it. You know, we're going to hit the iceberg at some point, and there's too much political momentum to stop that ship from hitting the iceberg. And there's so much truth in that. There's too much power, too much money for us to really address climate change. And, you know, in my opinion, and I actually found it to be really interesting. At first I thought he was going to lose me, but it's a very good analogy, and I agree with it. I completely agree with it. And yeah, so that was the film. Anyway, it was a really, really good documentary, a great documentary, in fact, really well edited and put together and filmed and shot. Like, I loved that kind of warehouse set and everything. And there's lots of other things I didn't touch on. So there's a lot to explore and enjoy. I love that it's on the Blu-ray. It's not just one of these things that you have to kind of track down on TV somewhere. So it feels like the Blu-ray is such a great complete package in that sense. It has all the behind the scenes on the movie, and then this extra thing, which is more about the actual ship itself. And it was a lot less dry than I thought it would be. And I really thoroughly enjoyed / loved this documentary, and I would highly recommend it. So there we go. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. And I guess at this point we are finally done with talking about Titanic, but I really am glad that I got to this one, because I found it to be a lot more enjoyable than I thought it would be, and a lot more interesting than I thought it would be, given the fact that I've done so much Titanic watching already. So it was kind of the perfect capping off of everything, and something really more focused on the actual ship itself. And it weaves in nice stuff from his dives to the ship, and all the, you know, the various expeditions he took, and the footage as well of inside the ship and everything. So it just marries a lot of that stuff together, including the clips from the movie, which gives you greater kind of dramatic context for the stuff that was happening on the ship. And so it's kind of a brilliant kind of amalgamation of all that, the source materials, and just brings you a nice complete look at the shipwreck. So anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.